In our study of Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Kena Upanishad, the parable of the gods has reached its end when the divine appears as a formless presence before the gods. They have sent forward first Agni, then Vayu, and then Indra. In the first two steps, when Agni is approaching the divine, seeking to know by his power, which is to cast into form, to place into limits, to create something which is finite, he is unable. But the first step, he is asked a question: what is the power in you? And Agni says it is the power to burn all this. When he cannot burn the blade of grass placed before him by the divine, he returns. Vayu then comes forward. He, being the life principle, is the one who inhabits the forms that Agni creates. And so, when he attempts to know the divine, it is by knowing the divine as something in which he can inhabit, in which he can awaken the life principle. And there he fails. But the question, when he is asked, what is your power? He says, I am he that expands in the mother of things. And so the same blade of grass is placed before him, and he is unable to blow it, because that is his power to fill everything, to carry everything, to enliven, bring to life. And he also returns. In contrast with these two, when Indra comes forward, there is no question placed before him, and when he fails to know, he does not come back. So this third God is extremely important for us. He is the one who finally will come closest to knowing the divine. And so within our being, when we look at these three powers, the working of Agni, Vayu and Indra, it is this power of Indra which we rely upon most to enter in relation with and to know the divine. But Indra's function is not possible unless before him Vayu has prepared his ground. And Vayu, although fails to know the divine, yet in his effort has made the foundation upon which Indra can build. And in the same way, before Vayu can do his work, Agni should have built the foundation. And we see here the sequence of evolution in us individually, through the physical consciousness, the vital being, and the mental consciousness. But also the same triple movement in the universe, and even in every small activity. There is first the building of the form, there is second the enlivening and dynamizing of the form, and third there is the awakening of the higher knowledge, where the form begins to open and relate to the source which it is meant to express. And when Indra is called upon to approach now, he is addressed by the gods as Master of plenitudes, get thou the knowledge, what is this mighty daemon? So be it, he says. He rushed upon that vanished from before him. Now Indra is addressed as Master of plenitudes, and we have to now understand why. If the Kena takes pains to specify this particular aspect of Indra, there is a good reason for it. And for that we must again turn to Sri Aurobindo. And what does it mean that the divine now vanishes? Why doesn't the divine ask a question? Why doesn't he go through the same process as he has with the other two gods? Why does he vanish? And for this, we will turn briefly to Sri Aurobindo's commentary in the secret of the Veda, where we have also turned to before for a deeper understanding both of Agni and of Vayu, and now of Indra. In the chapter titled Indra, Giver of Light. As before, Sri Aurobindo takes certain verses from the Rig Veda where Indra is invoked. And the overall drift of these 10 verses is that Indra is called to partake of the soma, the wine of rapture, intoxication, bliss. But when Indra is called, he is called as the fashioner of perfect forms, like a good yielder for the milker of the herds. And we call for increase from day to day. So Indra is being called for a very specific function here. He builds forms. He is the yielder for the milker of the herds, the cows, light. And he increases day to day the light. And he is offered the soma. Drinking the soma, he grows in strength. And he then gives his strength, his light to us, who are his friends. And Indra himself grows in intensity as he drinks the soma and gives us that intensity. And the last verse, Sri Aurobindo has translated thus: He who in his vastness is a continent of bliss. So it is not just Indra who has been invoked. Now Indra has grown powerful drinking the soma, and in his vastness he becomes the continent of bliss, the friend of the soma giver, and he carries him safely through. To that Indra raise the chant. So Indra also has this specific character that he takes you safely through. Through to what? Obviously the goal of the Vedic Rishi, which is to the realization. Sri Aurobindo's commentary, and we will again select only a few sentences, not go in detail. He explains first that these verses are at a particular stage in the evolution where the panis who hoard, who hide, who block off the light, they have been overcome, and the vritras who cover, and vala who holds back the light, these have been overpassed. So obviously a kind of a victory has been made. In the same position as in the Cana. Some kind of a victory of the gods has been achieved. The things which block and prevent us from growing, from awakening to the divine, they have been overcome. And at that point, when the gods are victorious, we have achieved to the best that the human being is capable of on his own effort. But it is not perfect. We are still very far from perfection, and we are unable to go beyond what little can be built up by the personal effort. So Sri Aurobindo writes here, but there are even then powers that stand in the way of our perfection. Something is missing, something is preventing. They are the powers of limitation, the confiners or censurers, who, without altogether obscuring the rays or damming up the energies, yet seek by constantly affirming the deficiencies of our self-expression to limit its field and set up the progress realized as an obstacle to the progress to come. This is something so important. In the yoga, this is the single biggest factor preventing the developed, conscious, aspiring, even awake human being from being able to go further. You're awake, you're conscious, you have a beautiful experience, you have access to a beautiful experience or knowledge or capacity or a gift. What happens then? That itself becomes a limitation. And so the powers he describes as confiners or censurers. They confine, They put you in limit. The limit may be large, so large that you think, I am now free. When you lock up a person in a little cell, he knows he's bound. But when you set him free, and he can wander over the entire field, the space is so large, he never reaches the limits, and so he considers himself free. It is the very first instinct which we have as human beings when we grow into our individual awareness. In our late teenage, we want to affirm our independence, our individuality, our capacity to grow, and we break out of the shackles of the family, of the social conventions, of whatever the limitations we feel. And breaking out, we say, now I am free. But what is the freedom that I have attained to? The freedom to indulge in my own impulses and desires and momentary instincts. I can do what I want. That's my freedom. But what is it that I want? That's where you're bound by your desires and instincts. The true freedom will be when you are free even from your own limitations, and you're truly able to do not just what you want as an impulse of desire, but whatever is necessary for the situation given. And that we do not have. We do not even conceive of that as the true freedom. So the confiners, capital C, they don't obscure the rays. They don't block your energies. So you have the sense that, yes, I am conscious. Yes, I can act, I can move. But they constantly affirm deficiencies of our self-expression to limit its yield. I can do what I want. But what I want is a very narrow band. When I have to cross what I want to what I need, I find, there's some limit, there's some difficulty, some incapacity. So the deficiency of our self-expression and limit its yield. I feel in myself so much, but I am unable to express. Or I express, but I am unable to fulfill in the expression that it would be complete, that it would be perfect. So the yield of the effort is somehow limited. And the progress which is realized is set up as an obstacle to the progress to come. And this is the most subtle of the barriers. Because we have done so much, because we have created so much, because after so many years we have achieved this great thing, we rejoice, we revel, and we pat ourselves on the back and say how great we are. And the work to be done is something so much more. We look at that and say, yes, it will happen. This is the ideal. It takes its own time. These things are difficult. And the effort stops. We do not realize that there's some flaw in us that prevents us from being able to achieve that. The self-satisfaction with the progress achieved, that itself becomes an obstacle to the progress to come. And at that point, Indra is being invoked. Madhu Chandas, that is the rishi of these verses, calls upon Indra to remove the defect and affirm in its place an increasing illumination. And now Sri Aurobindo explains, who is this Indra? What does he represent here? We will read a little bit in detail. The principle which Indra represents is mind power, M capital, P capital. Mind meaning not just our little thinking mind, but the full scope of what mind represents on its cosmic scale, including all the higher levels above the intellect, including the ranges that Sri Aurobindo calls the higher mind, illumined mind, intuitive mind, and so on. The full scope of what mind can be, including its higher diviner possibilities. But it's not just mind passive in knowledge, it is mind power. The power of the mind to be able to express, to be able to act, to be able to form, to change things. And that is what Indra represents. But it's not just mind power. It is mind power released from the limits and obscurations of the nervous consciousness. The moment this mind has got embedded in the human body, bound to the machinery of the body, it first connects here in the body not directly with the cells, not directly with the bones, but with the nerves. The nervous system in the human body is the part of the physical biology most susceptible and responsive to the contact of the mind. If you study the working of the cells, the hardest cells, the bones, are the most resistant, the most dense. Next, you have the muscles, which are able to move but bound within limits. They give you great force, but they are not themselves conscious. And then you have other tissue, more fine, more soft, more sensitive. The skin is the part in us, and with it the other senses which come. They're all finally skin. Even the eyes and the retina is a specialized skin. The hearing and the eardrum is a specialized skin. The smell, taste is all specialized skins. So the skin is the part in us which is most conscious, where you can touch and feel. And these cells are primarily connected through the nerves. Those become the most refined, the most conscious, the most able to communicate consciousness. And so this is the reason why, if in your hand, the nerve which connects the fingers to the brain, if the nerve is cut, suddenly the whole hand loses sensation. Because the nerves are what carry the consciousness itself and the sensation to the center of our awareness. So the nervous consciousness is not just the physical nerves, but beyond the physical nerves there is a finer gradation of what we may call subtle nerves, which in the Ayurvedic and yogic system is referred to as Sukshma Nadi, subtle nerves. And they are partly in the gross physical, partly in the subtle physical, and they bridge these two domains. And when the mind enters into the body and possesses this instrument, because before it comes it's just instrument. When the mind possesses, it enters from the top, from the most refined part in the subtle physical, and then gradually embeds itself more and more into the physical. This is the early stage in our childhood, where the child wants to reach out and grasp, but his fingers are not yet finely able to move. The mind has just plugged itself in and is still embedding itself into the physical nerves. And so the gross movements are now developed. I can move my arms, but the fine movements of the fingertips are not yet fully developed. And it takes a few years for the full embedding of the mind. If the child does not flow according to this instinct to embed, then you will find that those parts are not so developed. We see this in children in the early years. If the children are exposed extensively to sensory contact, their capacity and the sensitivity grows rapidly, because that's the time the physical nerves are growing and the mind gets a chance to get in. And the more the mind embeds itself through those fine nerves, the more it activates and makes them grow. If instead the child is denied a variety of rich sensational experiences, those nerve impulses, the nerve growths, do not take their full possibility because the mind is not pushing inside them to grow. The same thing happens when people have an injury and there is a damage to the nerves. You have a kind of a partial paralysis, and until the nerves grow back, you do not recover. But the nerves growing back is still moderated by the energy of the mind inside the nerves pushing. And so the method used medically, physically, is to force you to make the effort to move, which is paralyzed. And as a result of the effort, the mind pushes the subtle physical nerves, which pushes the gross physical nerves, and make them grow and rejoin. So the nervous system in us is the part of the gross body most susceptible to the mind's imprint. And for the mind, therefore, the first point of contact is to the gross body. As it has done that movement of entering and embedding itself, the mind finds itself bound and trapped in the limitation of the nervous system. We find, I am body, I am fingers. We identify so much that the mind does not know what it's like to be free from the physical consciousness. And as a result, the mind gets dulled, bound, limited. When now mind wants to expand and play freely, it feels this heaviness. When people take intoxicating substances, they suddenly feel this great freedom and lightness. And that's only because the mind has been momentarily released from this embedding identification. By dulling the gross body, not so much the body, by dulling the nervous system in the gross body, and to some extent in the subtle physical body, the mind is disconnected, disengaged, and momentarily feels itself free. But when that dulling sensation passes, it reconnects, and again it is bound. So, the principle which Indra represents is mind power released from the limits and obscurations of the nervous consciousness. And this nervous consciousness spanning the gross body and the subtle physical body is its limitation here. Limits and obscurations. So first of all, these are things which are, because they're nerves, they're finite, they limit the mind itself. And then because they are bound to the gross body, they dull the mind. And the experience is similar to what we have when we are very sleepy and you try to think of something. You take a difficult text which challenges your mind, take the Life Divine, and try to understand one sentence. And do this when you're half sleepy. Very difficult. Or you have just woken up from sleep, your mind is not perfectly fresh, and you try to read. It just doesn't work. The mind feels what? If you observe the quality, it feels dull, unable to move, unable to see, unable to flow. A kind of a rigidity, heaviness. And the same thing you do when your energies are flowing freely and brightly, and the mind just grasps and catches. What's the difference? It's the mind which is bound in limits and obscurations, and the mind which is liberated. So in the whole yogic educational system in India, in the old days, the effort was to remove this dulling influence by various means, including certain physical activities, certain breathing exercises, and the food and diet control, and a certain lifestyle. Wake up early, sleep early, and by synchronizing with the sun's rhythm, this particular layer, which is the nervous consciousness, wakes with the sun in bright freshness. When you're out of sync, you may go to a late night party, which is the fashion today, and you go to sleep as the sun rises. And the result is when you wake up, your nervous consciousness is the one which is out of sync. Because you went to sleep, the body may be sleeping, but the nervous consciousness is already awake because it's linked to the movement of the sun. It's already in a kind of an agitation, it does not get rest. The result will be, although you wake up, you feel tired, your mind feels tired. Your body may be able to function, but your mind is unable to function at its peak. And so in the old system of the education, they optimized all the life activities, including food, to make for this obscuration of the nervous consciousness to be removed as far as possible. Second, to dynamize the rajasic quality, the vital energy, but in discipline and structure, so that it obeys a higher authority. And third, to intensify the sattvic and particularly the mental awareness, so that it comes into its own as a self-aware, conscious, free awareness. The more the mind is free from its embedding of these limitations, the more it can choose freely. The more it's embedded, in this case, in the nervous consciousness, the more the nervous consciousness slants the mind's thought. So, you wake up with this dullness in the nervous consciousness, and today you have to study the Life Divine. You'll say, oh, I don't feel like. Where is this incapacity coming? in the dullness of the nervous consciousness, pulls down the mind, and the mind's capacity itself is modified, its intention is modified, and it says, I don't feel like, it's not interesting. The same mind, when it is fresh, will look at it and say, oh yes, this is interesting, I want to develop, I want to know. When in between the life energy sees the mind, it's the desire drive which clouds the mind. I know I should not eat sugar, but right now I feel the craving for the sweets. And so let me have a little bit. And after that, a little more. Today is an exception, it's a special occasion, so I will have the whole thing. And bit by bit you'll find how the mind deceives itself until you regret. And right at the beginning you know you will regret, but you have to hide from yourself that knowledge in order to be able to fulfill the desire. But who was leading? It was not your conscious mind. It was not the free working mind. It was the desire instinct possessing the mind, pulling it. And these are not the statuses of Indra being free, of the mind being free. When the mind is taught to be free and separate in itself, the more it disengages from nervous consciousness as well as desire drive, it can stand back, and such people will say, yes, I know, I love that, but, and I feel the desire also, if I could, I would, but I prefer not to. And there's not much struggle. The fact that there is a struggle is a sign that there is still this embedding, and it needs to be disengaged. So in the process of the integral yoga, the very first foundation Sri Aurobindo lays is purification. And purification is of two kinds. One is the separation of each of these layers. So mind has to be disentangled from the nervous body consciousness as well as the desire based life energies. And when it comes into its own, it can fulfill its real function. And the second aspect of the purification is removing limitations, freeing it now to be able to work. And you see this now described here. The principle which Indra represents is mind power released from the limits and obscurations of the nervous consciousness. It is this enlightened intelligence which fashions right or perfect forms of thought or of action, not deformed by the nervous impulses, not hampered by the falsehood of sense. And so this is what we have been describing. As long as mind is embedded and bound in the limitations of the lower grades of consciousness, when it tries to form a thought, there is a deformation. It cannot function freely as it wants to, as it needs to by its truth. So enlightened intelligence which fashions right or perfect forms of thought or of action. Remember, Indra is not just the knowledge aspect but also the power aspect of mind to express itself and to change circumstances. The nervous impulses are always the deforming here. And the falsehood of the senses he speaks of. What is the falsehood of the senses? In its most comprehensive aspect, falsehood of the senses is the illusion that you have of reality when you look at the world. And you say, this is a tree, that is a flower, that is a mountain, this is me. No, I am not body. No, that is not just tree, that is not just flower, that is not just mountain. That is a living being, but I don't see it because my senses don't allow me to see it. But there are deeper faculties within us which sense it. In our heart, in our refined emotions, when we meet the flower, something in us bursts open and says, so beautiful. And we become soft like the flower momentarily. If we took the trouble to similarly feel the tree, we would feel it is conscious. And it is so still, so soft, so gentle. It is astounding when you are able to feel that consciousness in the tree. You cannot imagine yourself becoming so gentle and so still. Such is the stillness of the tree. And it is in that stillness that the tree feels most intensely its sensations. Because it is so still, it can have an intensity of sensations far greater than the human nervous system. But we can begin to feel those things, but in our deeper, finer grades. But in our physical senses, oh, this is just what it is. So the woodcutter, let's say during the colonial period, colonizers from Europe would come to Burma, huge forest. They went to the Americas, gigantic trees, 2000 years old. And what did they see? Money. They didn't call them trees, they called them lumber, timber. These are the words used. Effectively, the term is dead tree, hunk of wood. But that's all the physical senses can see. And with it, the vital mix of the senses is money, power, possession, authority, all of which come with it. So cut the trees and ship them back. Not once the higher faculty of mind stops to say, they have been growing for 2000 years. They're older than even our civilizations. And they're conscious beings, so precious. And there were a few like that. There were a few. I had occasion to visit in the West Coast in California, some of these redwood forests. There are no more forests, they're just small patches of redwood, named after the person who owned that property of land. Owned means came and basically built a fence and said, I own it. That's how they came. So he owned that, and he said, no, I will not cut them. Although he would have made a lot of money had he cut them. Because he kept it, all the others were cut out. You just see bald hills. All the forests were cut off. And you have these little patches, 2 or 3 places. And because they protected them, they've survived. Otherwise we would not see, because in our lifetime you will never see a tree grow so big. It took 2000 years for them to be so big. These were the people who represented something of the higher part of the humanity, who said, no, there is something more precious. And this is what we need in the early stages of our education. When that is not done, and most of modern education today, in what comes in the category of modern education, is primarily focusing on the values which come with the physical senses. What science teaches you of the reality of the world and of yourself is just the truth of the pure physical senses. We are a bunch of molecules which fell into place by chance. What purpose therefore in life? Satisfy your desire impulse, because you have only one life. It's going to end soon, make the most of it. That's all there is. There's no other purpose. There's nothing else one can conceive of. Now, when you've been brought up with this falsehood of the senses, and the mind feels something deeper, or sees or senses something deeper, or the heart feels, what happens? That higher perception is dulled, distorted, or even completely covered up. But at the very least, he uses this word, hampered by the falsehood of the senses. Something is trying to emerge, but the falsehood of the senses comes up, blocks, limits, distorts. And this is the only reason why in us, even as conscious practitioners of the yoga, we have periods of doubt. Suddenly you say, oh, but is all this true? I feel aspiration at times, and then when it goes away, I wonder, was it all true? Was it my imagination? There are intensities where you feel your entire life is committed to a spiritual realization, and then the dullness of the senses come and say, what is all that? Where is all that? Where is God? Where is the divine? And this is the alternation coming only from this influence of the dulling falsehood of the senses and the deformation by the nervous impulses. The primary drive even of our desire nature is operating through the nervous impulses. And that's why you will see all of the desires which are the most compelling are tied to physical sense, pleasure and satisfaction. And so in the verses, Sri Aurobindo points out, he explains how the image is of the cow and the herd of cows, and the word used is go. Go means light, illumination, a ray of light. And it is this which is used by the Vedic symbolism to, in their double language. For light, in their view, is not merely an apt poetic image of thought, but is actually its physical form. It's not just an image of thought, but the physical form of thought. Now, what does that mean? Is in passing, Sri Aurobindo leaves you with a gem. And if you meditate on this, you find something extraordinary. Remember, we have spoken of many planes of consciousness. And there is the mind world. You have thoughts, and they take place in the domain or grade of consciousness of mind. But also remember, everything is part of oneness. Everything is connected with everything else. Everything influences everything else. And so even what happens in the mind world has its influence on the life world of prana and of the physical world of form. And so if mind leans now in its influence on form and touches the world of form, matter, how would you sense it in the physical matter? Light. It's very interesting. He says, read the whole sentence. The word go means in Sanskrit both a cow and a ray of light. This double sense is used by the Vedic symbolists to suggest a double figure, which was to them more than a figure. It's a reality, it's not just a picture. For light, in their view, is not merely an apt poetic image of thought, but is actually its physical form. And the error we make when we read something which is poetic or written in form of poetry, because it has all kinds of wondrous fantasies sometimes in poetry, we say, it's just poetry. Beautiful pictures. But the Vedic seers were not creating beautiful fantasies and pictures. They were describing their experience of reality. But an experience of reality which is much more complete. And here is thought is not just a poetic image of thought that you call light, but the physical form of thought is light. Now let's look at it this way, first in our subjective experience, then in its objective form. In your mind, suddenly you have an idea. How do you describe it? I had a flash. I have a brilliant idea. You don't say, I have a cloudy idea. You don't say, I have a dark idea. You say, brilliant idea. Always the intensity and clarity of the idea is associated in the mind with an experience which you can only use the vocabulary of light. Flash, brilliance, bright, clear, and so on. So at least in our subjective experience, when the thought comes, all the associations of light are there inside us. The same thing happens in your experience of your body. Let's say you become conscious of your hand. Mostly we are unconscious because we are lost in our own thoughts. Become conscious of your hand. Feel your hand. And then intensify your awareness of the hand. And it's easy to do. You just put attention and brighten it. The moment you intensify, what does it feel? I use the vocabulary instinctively. Brighten it. You actually feel as if your hand is lit up in your awareness. That's again the sense of light in a most material level, but all felt subjectively inside. So you'll say, all right, it's still an image, it's still a figure. But for the Vedic seers, it's not just a figure, a poetic figure. Actually, the physical form of light, the physical form of thought is light. And this is what we see here. When the sun rises, what changes? You're sitting in your room, you're sitting in a forest, everything is dark, you do not see. As the sun rises or you light a lamp, you begin to see everything. The things were already there, they were always there. There are many interesting stories of this kind. There's a story which comes to mind. A person falls over the edge of a cliff. And as he falls, he grabs hold of a branch which is growing out from the ledge, and he holds on to dear life through the night, struggling with all effort. And when the sun rises, he looks down and he sees that his feet are barely a meter above the ground. This is the condition of our ignorance. Until we see, we do not know how close the things are which we are desperately seeking. When the light comes, suddenly everything becomes clear and obvious, and we know what is to be done. Now, this is not only an experience in the mind, it's the reality of the physical experience. But what's really happening when the light comes? The sun rises. Let's go through the physical operation. In your retina, from there the light and the image goes to your brain. From there to mind. Who is seeing finally? Mind. What is the mind seeing? The awareness. The awareness which has come in from an objective external process. The light dawning was the awareness which revealed itself. And that the mind registers through the senses. So the physical form of thought actually is light. And wherever there is an intense concentration of thought, you have the experience of light and even of heat. And in physical processes, we can capture this. We do not yet understand why. When you pass electricity with great intensity in a piece of metal, it grows bright until it grows incandescent, light and heat. This is exactly in the material domain a replication of what happens in your mind. In your mind, what is the electricity? The play of the delight. When the delight consciousness grows and intensifies, the light grows. And the same thing is happening on the physical level. And you can see why, because this is how the Vedic seers saw reality. This description of the text can be seen in its spiritual truth, in its psychological truth, and its physical truth. And the same text is describing a physical process as it is describing a psychological and spiritual process. Because they're describing reality, the same reality spanning 3 grades of experience. So, for light in their view is actually its physical form of thought. Thus, the herds that are milked are the herds of the sun, Surya, god of the revelatory and intuitive mind, or else the dawn, the goddess who manifests the solar glory. Okay, that being the case, where is Indra coming in? The Rishi desires from Indra a daily increase of this light of truth by his fuller activity pouring rays in a rich yield upon the receptive mind. So all the awareness of the thought to flow in, to grow day by day. The activity of the pure illuminated intelligence is sustained and increased by the conscious expression in us of the delight in divine existence and divine activity typified by the Soma wine. And so this is the meaning of offering the Soma to Indra. That when this delight in the divine activity and existence grows, there is the increase in the activity of the illuminated intelligence. Now let's look at this from a very human experience. As children, you notice, oh, what is that? Your curiosity grows. That's interesting. I've never seen it. And the joy of the interesting experience turns. As the joy intensifies, there is an increased activity. With the curiosity, increased activity, increased thought, increased awareness, and with it the illumination. Ah, this is what it is. How wonderful. So first it was the delight experience which turned your attention, which increased the knowledge, the light, and as the light grew, it intensified the delight also. What a wonderful experience, what a wonderful discovery. Now you remove that first step. Remove that enthusiasm and enjoyment and the delight. Look at that, you say, child looks, okay, now what, teacher? You see, in children in whom the curiosity and enthusiasm has been killed, this is what happens. And it's sad to see children sitting stiffly in classrooms and the teacher says, keep quiet, don't talk, don't move, don't think. repeat after me, and they go on repeating. What happens after a while, the mind dulls and the body is going on. I had occasion to see also in some monastery, they were learning, little children, they were learning things by heart. And what happens is, you're breathing in sync with the verses that you're learning by heart and without understanding. And you're breathing. So after a while, with the breathing, there's a movement of the body. When you breathe in, it moves back. You breathe out, it compresses. And it's in sync with the verses. And bit by bit, that movement intensifies. Until within half an hour, you see all the children together back and forth. Where is their mind? Numbed, dulled, no curiosity. And the same children, if they are activated early on, this is what we do in the integral education approach, this is what you see in the Montessori method. They pick the children at the age of 2 or 3, expose them to a variety of rich activities without imposing anything. It's all there. And automatically the child goes and starts playing with the things which are immediately of interest to his consciousness. And I've seen this, I've experimented for a long time. When I meet people visiting somebody's house and I notice the children, I will ask someone, did your child grow up in a Montessori school? The child may be 10 years old, 15 years old, they may be in a completely different school now. Did he grow up in a Montessori school? And they'll say, oh yes, he's not in a Montessori school now, but the first 5 years he was in a Montessori school. And so yes, the imprint is obvious. There is innately a clarity and brightness and curiosity of the mind, healthy, and a formed individuality and self-confidence. Just from that early 3 or 4 years. And it's the particular quality I've learned now to recognize. It's so distinct, you can make out straight away. These children grew up differently. And often it doesn't matter what they do after that. If that early formation has been done right, it's there. In the ashram school, the mother similarly removing the exams. She removed the goad of fear and reward. See, when you want a donkey to move forward, you put a carrot in front and you hit behind with a stick. Fear, pain, and reward in front. Desire driven. You remove that, what happens? So when I tell people, in our school we don't have exams. First, surprise. Second, happiness. Then third, doubt. How do the children learn? How do they study? Because the assumption is, unless you are given this goad of fear and reward, you will not do anything. Because that's how they grew up. And mother explains that the goal here is to awaken in the children the joy of learning. And what is this joy of learning? If you think about it deeply, Soma. In its most early first contact, delight in the divine existence and divine activity, typified by the Soma wine. Okay, we are not speaking of divine existence yet. We are not yet in a divine activity, but the reflection of the divine existence and the divine activity is in us. In the spontaneous joy we have in life. And children have it already. If you have not beaten it down and covered it up, it's already there. All you need to do is nourish, support, and help it to grow. And if you do that early on, that develops all the capacities and for the full growth. Remember what I described earlier. The effort you make to move, to learn, to experience through the senses amplifies the growth of the nervous system. And even in adult life, this is possible. In adult life, you can regrow the nerve connections which have been damaged because of an accident. And that means even in adult life, if you enter through your senses with greater enthusiasm, greater energy, greater brightness and delight, all your senses will grow and your nervous system will continue to grow. Maybe slower, because your biology is a little slower, but it will grow. And the subtle body nerves, the sukshma nadis, the subtle nerves, they can grow. They are not bound by your gross body's aging. They can grow rapidly. And sometimes within a few days you can experience a difference. So if you're interested, you try this experiment. You sit in a space like a garden or some plants, or just one plant with a flower or leaves. And you sit in front, and through your eyes, through your ears, through your smell and touch, all senses intensely enter in connection with this, enjoying it as something expressive of the divine. Easier to do with a flower, but whatever you may do, intensify with the senses and enjoy the colors, the form, the shape, the smell, the touch, with full intensity of that delight and enjoyment. Do this for 3 days. Fourth day, you will notice everything feels so much richer, so much brighter. And after that, you turn to gaze upon the rest of the world, you will see all the colors more intensely and more brightly. Something changes inside you. And this is the awakening of the subtle nerves, which become somehow brighter, and with it, the subtle senses. So we have wandered a little bit to elaborate on this idea, but with this background now, when we return to the text, you will understand it more deeply. The activity of the pure illuminated intelligence is sustained and increased by the conscious expression in us of the delight in the divine existence and divine activity, typified by the Soma wine. So as there is an increase of the delight in the divine existence and divine activity, the pure illuminated intelligence grows in its activity and is nourished in its activity and grows more. And when it grows, the capacity for delight also grows. And so there's a mutual exchange. The Rishi here is offering the Soma wine to Indra. Indra grows in plenitude in you, and he gives you back what he has received, but in greater capacity of your own consciousness, in your own freedom of the mind power, released from the limits and obscurations. So, we continue. As the intelligence feeds upon it, on the Soma wine, that is the delight in divine existence and divine activity, as the intelligence feeds upon it, its action becomes an intoxicated ecstasy of inspiration, by which the rays come pouring abundantly and joyously in. So now we need to see with an example something closer to the nature of what it means to take delight in the divine existence. We saw what happens as a child and in the human activity as it is. But the same activity now turned one step up. You look at the same scene differently. In the message that the mother gave to the students for their athletics competition, she said something like, I am unfortunately not very good with long text, but something to this effect, that replace the ambition for success by the will to do the best possible. And so on, 3 or 4 lines which follow. And in each of them, what she's doing is replacing the drive of the instinct by something else, which is the awakening of the consciousness, the increase of the evolutionary upward turn. And you have exactly the same activity. It does not matter whether you're going to run, you're going to do a somersault, you're going to swim, sweep the floor, or walk, climb stairs. It does not matter what you're doing. It's this shift internally of the attitude of the consciousness, the meaning that you have to yourself and to the life you have. If you now consciously do this, that you take up an activity, bring into it the sense of a divine consecration, the sweeping of the floor. The floor itself is the sacred space where the divine will manifest. Your sweeping is preparing for the divine's coming. And you will see the enthusiasm which naturally grows in you. And it's easiest, of course, to do when you believe it, not just imagine it. So you will see the enthusiasm with which people will sweep a temple, perhaps. Going to the Golden Temple, where the aspect of service is very strong in the Sikh tradition. It was interesting to see sometimes people of very great positions of authority and power, businessmen, even politicians, they will sit there and take people's slippers in their hands. And they do it with such enthusiasm. The fellow is running, sweeping the floor, and you can see the vitality and enjoyment he has. I have an opportunity today to serve in the sacred space. The same thing can be awakened, but when you bring it into your space of life, you're doing it for the mother. Taking another example, in the ashram we had in the old days, people stitching saris for the mother, which mother would wear at some point. So the ladies doing the embroidery, sometimes they were so elaborate and complex and beautiful that it would take them 9 or 10 months to finish a single sari. And mother will wear it only once, out of respect, out of courtesy for that person. But in all those 9 or 10 months, the person is thinking of mother is going to wear. And each stroke, each movement, each form is made remembering her with that consecration and made perfect for her. And the result is this. As the intelligence feeds on this delight in the divine existence and the divine activity, as the intelligence feeds upon it, its action becomes an intoxicated ecstasy of inspiration. So the person doing this is now so immersed in that ecstasy of that communion of the action itself. And naturally with it also an inspiration. Something happens which on your own you could not have made so beautiful. Ask a person to spend 9 or 10 months to stitch out this beautiful sari for sale to the highest bidder. You won't get a 10-month commitment. They will do it within a few weeks at best, but not much more. And increasingly we find in the old crafts where they used to make saris by hand with very complex weaves, the craft itself is dying because people don't want to commit to long periods of such effort. And the machine can do it anyway. The enthusiasm flags very quickly when you're doing it for a short-term limited objective or when you do it for yourself. There's very little that can stay. The greed has only a limited power to drive you. But this immersion, intoxicated ecstasy of inspiration, that can go on forever. It can go on across lifetimes. That is why when you do the sadhana, you can say it does not matter if it will take a few lives. I'm enjoying the journey, it is so beautiful and the goal is so beautiful. And it doesn't matter if it takes a few lives. But this can only happen when that inner enthusiasm has awakened and not the ambitious drive or personal interests and so on. So there's a very interesting word used here, intelligence feeds upon it. So the experience is literally that the immersion in the delight is like a nourishment. In fact, this is the nourishment of the psychic being, the delight in the world experience. But the intelligence, capital I, your mind now suffused with this, feeding upon it, its action becomes an intoxicated ecstasy of inspiration, by which the rays come pouring abundantly and joyously in. Again, the very interesting suggestion. The rays themselves are not only in abundance, but joyous. The light is happy to pour in. Remember, what pours in as a light is conscious light, is divine light, which is consciousness. And the consciousness is happy to pour into a vessel which is full of this delight. And that's why when you offer your delight, the response also is to further intensify. Exchange going on, which builds. And in quotation marks from the verse, Sri Aurobindo writes, light giving indeed is the intoxication of thee in thy rapture. This is addressed to Indra. For then it is possible, breaking beyond the limitations still insisted upon by the confiners, to arrive at something of the finalities of knowledge possible to the illuminated intelligence. So when this happens, then the limitations which were put by the confiners, they break down. And there is a possibility to arrive at the finalities of knowledge, the limits that knowledge can take you to, in the illuminated intelligence. And this is exactly what is happening in the Kena Upanishad. And so we come back to the text. That Indra is approaching, and as he approaches, he rushed upon that vanished from before him. And now instead of coming back, this knowledge is going towards the limits, the finalities of knowledge. And he reaches the finalities where he cannot go further, but he needs help from someone else. He in the same ether came upon the woman. This is Uma Haimavati. Even upon her who shines out in many forms, Uma, daughter of the snowy summits. To her he said, what was this mighty demon? And she reveals, it is the eternal. Of the eternal is this victory in which you shall grow to greatness. Then alone he came to know that this was the Brahman. So you see why Indra is the link point. It is he who takes you across to the limits, to the finalities of the knowledge, by breaking limits to the finalities of knowledge, beyond limits. And that's why he is giver of light, he is intensifier, he has been described earlier as master of plenitudes. Because he brings this plentiful character. So we have to pause because of time, but we now have a clear sense of what is the role of Indra, how he overcomes the limits, and in overcoming the limits, he himself goes to the extreme of what is possible in the ether, formless, limitless. And then something more is required to complete the knowledge. So we will explore this next time, which will be after a gap of 1 month, and it will be November 26th. We will start the classes from November 24th, which is the Friday, and from 24th onwards we will have the classes here. This text now we have dwelt upon to understand more deeply the meaning of these three gods emerging, and the last step is the link with the Divine Mother, who alone can teach you of the eternal directly. But the instrument which receives that knowledge is the mind, freed from its confining limits and opened now to its own higher possibilities. And it is towards this that we have to aspire in our efforts. We can meditate on this briefly.